Bihari. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jayam Vishnupad Paramhansa Paribrajakacharya Sotara Satashishi Mad A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Namacharya Srila Haridas Thakur Ki Jai. Prem se kaho Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktivinoda Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Krishna Gopa Gopinatha Shai Kunda Radha Kunda Giri Govardhan Ki Jai. Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai. Mayapur Dham Ki Jai. Jagannath Puri Ki Jai. Jagannath Baladev Subhadra Ki Jai. Ganga Mai Ki Jai. Jamuna Mai Ki Jai. Tulsi Maharani Ki Jai. Bhakti Devi Ki Jai. Samaveda Bhaktavrinda Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Gauranga. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. Okay. Today we have a very exciting section. Prabhupada is now moving to the Bowery. April month is passing through. We'll hear every day what Prabhupada writes in his diary. And now we're able to follow along with Satsvarup Maharaj's Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita Volume 2. We have Mukunda Das Goswami's Miracle on 2nd Avenue, because he was personally present with Srila Prabhupada when Prabhupada lived at the Bowery. And he became a devotee at that time. He carried Prabhupada's Srimad Bhagavatam books wherever he went. Even when he was in the grocery store, when he was waiting to make payments, he would be reading the book. Everywhere. He was so attached to Prabhupada's teachings. So some of the things slightly differ between what Satsvarup Maharaj writes and what Mukunda Das Goswami remembers. And Mukunda, he explains that in the very beginning. Just a little note. He says, author's note, this is a true story. However, some of the names were changed for a variety of reasons. Satsvarup Das Goswami Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita is, by my estimation, a fine document that portrays Srila Prabhupada's founding of the Hare Krishna movement. In this book, the reader will see through my eyes. I do not think that my account is perfectly objective, but histories and biographies must always be as accurate as possible. My story in some minor ways differs from what Satsvarup Das Goswami has so expertly written. However, my purpose is to tell a true story. So we'll see these slight differences. Mostly the differences are in the names, because Satsvarup Maharaj might have changed some names, and even Mukunda Das Goswami, he says he has changed some names for whatever purposes there were. So last week, at the end of the class, we can never put enough, the time just runs out so quickly. When Prabhupada was living at the loft, the Village Voice, which was a newspaper that comes out every week in the Greenwich Village, that whole area, and Mukunda Maharaj, he has this article that was in the Village Voice. It's not mentioned yet in the Prabhupada Lilamrita. But after getting out my magnifying glass and studying all this small script, I was able to read what they wrote about Prabhupada. So I'm going to read that to you now because it's not in the Lilamrita as we have it yet. Prabhuji. और एक बार क्या आगे ठीक है. Village Voice article about the Swami in the loft in New York. The meeting of the mystical East and the practical West comes alive in the curious contrast between A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami and his American disciples. Of course, Srila Prabhupada didn't have disciples at that time, but this is how the newspaper reporter described those few followers who were coming to the Bowery for Prabhupada's classes. The Swami, a cultivated man at 70 with a distinguished education, is here for a year to preach his gospel of peace, goodwill, nearness to God, and more practically to raise money for his American church. The practical sale of the Swami's nature inspires his American followers far less than the mystical. Like his teachings, the Swami is sensible and direct. His main teachings, not connected with any religion, although he is a Hindu, is that mankind may come closer to God by reciting his holy name. This is more than a mystical process, as a line in his pamphlet indicates, quote, "And when shall all the holes of hair on my body have eruptions by the recitation of your name?" During services last week, the Swami sat cross-legged in his temporary headquarters in a tiny Chinatown loft. So the Bowery is right next to Chinatown. A dozen or so disciples helped out with chanting and cymbals. Despite the fact that the Swami came to America to seek out the roots of godless materialism, a disease he says that has already enveloped India, he is a realistic man. If there is any place on earth to build a temple, it is here. Swami Bhaktivedanta leads a monastic life. He is a strict vegetarian and will permit no women to touch his food. I don't know where he got that idea, because all women were always cooking for Prabhupada. His only drink is milk, the miracle food for babies and old men. He has translated 60 volumes of Sanskrit lore into English to aid in his teaching mission. The Swami wishes to found in America the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, which will be open for anyone, including women, to join. They will meet next on Friday evening. The curious may call, and Prabhupada got his phone there, WA32648. Prabhupada got that phone just before he had to swiftly leave because Paul Murray had misbehaved and become violent. So, now we'll go on with the reading. And Satsrup Maharaj, he gives a very long description of this Bowery area, and we have some confirming slides here to show you. Srila Prabhupada's new home, the Bowery, had a long history. In the early 1600s, when Manhattan was known as New Amsterdam and was controlled by the Dutch West India Company, Peter Minuit, the governor of New Netherland, staked out a north-south road that was called the Bowery, because a number of Boweries or farms lay on either side. It was a dusty country road, lined with quaint Dutch cottages and bordered by the peach orchards growing in the estate of Peter Stuyvesant. It became part of the high road to Boston and was of strategic importance during the American Revolution as the only land entrance to New York City. So you can see here, there's one long road that goes all throughout this whole island of Manhattan. Now this island, just at the tip there, it continues. The Bronx is there and other parts of New York State. And that road continues all the way up the coast to the next big city, which is Boston. Oh. There. So that's why this particular road that the Dutch built was very important, because it ran along the entire island and continued up the coast of America. Now the next picture has a better description. Here we see when the Dutch purchased the island from the American Indians, they built a walled-in city at the tip of Manhattan. All of you have probably heard of the World Trade Centers that were blown up. They were right at the bottom here, where the two rivers meet and then the Atlantic Ocean starts. So this whole area was the city, and then outside of the wall, it's called the 6 Great Boweries. And that's where all of the farmland was. They had sheep pastures, and they had peach orchards, and the wealthy landowners, the governor and people like that, like Peter Stuyvesant and his other family members, they had very nice cottages on the left side there. So it was a settlement of colonists. America was a place for freedom of religion. So the European countries where there was strict control of Catholicism coming from Rome, those who protested against the Catholic doctrine, or those who wanted to live their own religious way of life, they came to America. And also merchants came to take advantage of the new land. So the Dutch people, they set up their colony here in Manhattan. The English, they were in Boston. The Spanish, they were down south in Florida. The French, they were up in Canada. So all different nationalities came for this new huge land. They couldn't even imagine yet how big the expanse of the North and South America was. And they were taking advantage of it because it was a new world, and therefore they could have their freedom there away from the constrictions of the European culture. So here we have the Bowery in its original form when it was beautiful gardens and cottages. In the early 1800s, the Bowery was predominated by German immigrants. Later in the century, it became predominantly Jewish. And gradually it became the city's center of theatrical life. So as more and more immigrants came, the Germans came, the German Protestants, the Italians came, the Chinese came, and a lot of Jewish immigrants came because there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, and they were being murdered in Russia and different Spain, places like that. So the Jewish immigrants came and set up ghettos. And just on the other, just near where Prabhupada lived, just around the corner, was a big Jewish ghetto also. And there was a Chinese Chinatown just right there. And when you walked into these places, it was as if you were in China. The signs were all in Chinese. In the Jewish section, the signs were all in Hebrew, because that was where they all congregated, and they made their own communities there. And then, finally, the Bowery, as more and more people moved in, it became a cultural center, became the theatrical center. However, as a history of Lower Manhattan describes, after 1870 came the period of the Bowery's celebrated degeneration. Fake auction rooms, saloons specializing in 5-cent whiskey and knockout drops, sensational dime museums, filthy and rat-ridden stale beer dives, together with Charles M. Hoyt's song, the Bowery, I'll never go there anymore. Fixed it forever in the nation's consciousness as a place of unspeakable corruption. So, in the theatrical world, New York became very famous. There were a lot of musicians and artists and actors who gravitated to New York. And there was a drama made about the Bowery. And there was a song, and actually the name of the drama was called A Visit to Chinatown. How one man from outside of New York comes and visits New York, because New York can be a very dangerous place. It's like a jungle there, if you don't know your way around. And if you walk into the wrong section of town, you can really be in trouble. So there was a song written about the Bowery. And I put it here because Satsvarup Maharaj describes it, and we'll understand better how Prabhupada, what he had to tolerate in order to preach to the youth who were just around the corner. And some of them were also living in the Bowery as well, such as Mukunda and Janaki. They later became two of Prabhupada's first initiates. Oh, the night that I struck New York, I went out for a quiet walk. Folks who are on to the city say, better by far that I took Broadway. So Broadway is on the western side. That was where Prabhupada lived before, and he would have to cross Broadway to go to Dr. Mishra's apartment. But I was out to enjoy the sights. There was the Bowery ablaze with lights. I had one of the devil's own nights. I'll never go there anymore. And then the song's refrain is, the Bowery, they say such things, and they do strange things on the Bowery. I'll never go there anymore. I had walked but a block or two when up came a fellow as if me he knew. Then a policeman came walking by, chased him away, and I asked him why. Wasn't he pulling your leg? Usually the derelicts there, the alcoholics and the drug addicts, they'll go up just like the beggars do here, and they'll ask you for something. And they might even try to steal something from you while they're talking to you. Said I, he never laid hands on me. And then the policeman said to him, get off the Bowery, you yap, said he. I'll never go there anymore. So a yap, because they're country people and they're city people. And when the country people come to New York, they don't realize how many thieves there are, how many alcoholics there are, how many people there are that you have to be careful of. So a slang word, there's a lot of American slang that you won't hear anywhere else in the world. So one of them is yap, and it means a country bumpkin. That he thought the man was just talking to him like a friend, but the man had come to either steal from him or beg from him. So the police told him to get out of here. I went into an auction store. I never saw any thieves before. It was an innocent man. First he sold me a pair of socks. Then he said, how much for the box? Someone said $2. I said $3. He emptied the box and gave it to me. I sold you the box, not the socks, said he. I'll never go there anymore. So they would cheat people. I had this experience also, living, because I was a country girl, and you go to New York, and you don't know how sharp the people are. So we had to buy a telephone. I went and I got the cheapest phone there was. It was $10. And I was thinking, oh boy, this is really nice. We'll have a phone now, and and I go to plug it in, and it doesn't work. So I take it back, and they wouldn't take it back. So that's how they cheat people. They know when you're innocent, and they know that they can cheat you. So I lost my $10, and I didn't have a phone. So because we're country bumpkins, we don't know about these smart city slickers. So in these auction houses, they try to, they'll auction something, and they'll show you something, but they'll give you something else. And that's what happened to this man. So I have some pictures here accompanying it. This is how the alcoholics at night or during the day when they're completely drunk, they'll just lie on the pavements, on the streets, and in a drunken stupor, they'll just sleep there. Or if they're lucky, they'll find a cardboard box and they'll sleep in the box as well. I went into a concert hall. I didn't have a good time at all. Just the minute that I sat down, girls began singing, "New coon in town." A coon means a buffoon, a fool. They could tell right away, here's a country boy. I got up mad and spoke out free. "Somebody put that man out," said she. So as soon as he objected, they called a bouncer. A man called a bouncer attended to me. So they picked him up and they threw him out of the concert hall. I went into a barber shop. He talked till I thought he'd never stop. I said, "Cut it short." He misunderstood, clipped down my hair just as close as he could. He shaved with the razor that scratched like a pin, took off my whiskers and most of my chin. That was the worst scrape I'd ever been in. I'll never go there anymore. So here's this poor man going from shop to shop, getting cheated and mistreated everywhere he goes. I struck a place that they called a dive. A dive is a sleazy bar, you know, where the poorest people go and you get cheap liquor. They have signs, just like we always read about the Deshi Sharab here, and whole villages will die because someone gives them bad alcohol. So that's what the type of places they were. They would give bad alcohol, and they would have signs that this week 39 people died from the, so to warn them. I was in luck to get out alive. When the policeman heard of my woes, saw my black eye and my battered nose, "You've been held up," said the copper. The copper means a policeman. Fly. "No, sir, but I've been knocked down," said I. Then he laughed, though I could not see why. I'll never go there anymore. So in America, the Bowery is called Skid Row. It's another North American slang because in every big city, even here also, there's a bad part of town. Even here in Vrindavan, we have a bad part of town. It's not so evident anymore because everything's getting built up. But 50 years ago, there was a bad part of town, and it was where the sweepers lived, and they keep their pigs, and we would see them. They would capture a pig, tie up its mouth, tie up its hands, 4 feet, put a stick through, and burn a fire under it, and burn the pig alive. So that's right down the road here. I won't mention the name of the part of town. So we would see these horrible things going through the point is, there's always a bad part of town. So in New York City, that bad part of town was the Bowery. And another name for it was Skid Row. And the reason it got the name Skid Row is because on the west coast of America, they have big, big trees. And the people who cut the lumber, they use roads to pull these trees after they've been cut. They skid the trees down the roads. And when the lumberjacks get fired from their work, they get sent down this road also. So that's where the word Skid Row came from the West Coast. But here on the East Coast, New York, this Bowery was called Skid Row, because whenever anyone's down and out, that was where they would go to live. Okay. Here. Next. All right. So now we'll go on. That was the very famous song about the Bowery that made the Bowery famous all over America as a very disreputable place. The reaction of Prabhupada's electrician friend was not unusual. the Bowery is still known all over the world as Skid Row, a place of ruined and homeless alcoholics. Perhaps the uptown electrician had done business in the Bowery and had seen the derelicts sitting around passing a bottle or lying unconscious in the gutter, or staggering up to a passerby and drunkenly bumping into them to ask for money. Most of the Bowery's 7,000 or 8,000 homeless men slept in lodging houses that required them to vacate their rooms during the day. Having nowhere else to go and nothing else to do, they would loiter on the street, standing silently on the sidewalks, leaning against a wall, or shuffling slowly along alone or in groups. In cold weather, they would wear 2 coats and several suits of clothes at once, and would sometimes warm themselves around a fire they would keep going in a city garbage can. At night, those without lodgings slept on the sidewalks, doorsteps, and street corners, crawled into discarded boxes, or sprawled side by side next to the bars. Thefts were commonplace. A man's pockets might be searched 10 or 20 times while he slept. The rates of hospitalization and death in the Bowery were 5 times higher than the national average, and many of the homeless men bore marks of recent injuries or violence. So Mukunda, in his book, he describes, because Prabhupada's loft was in 92, the Bowery. That was the number of the building. And Mukunda lived at 110, which is just a few houses away. And Mukunda, he agreed to live there because the rent was so cheap. They were paying $55 a month. And the place was so big, and because he was a musician, he could make all the noise he wanted. He would have his musician friends come up to his loft, and they would, it's called, I forget what the word is, but they would play music all night long. They would have jigs, that's it. So that was their lifestyle. So they needed a room, a big room, where they could do their music. So that was why he moved to the Bowery. So the place where Prabhupada moved, we'll read about that now. Prabhupada's loft, 94 Bowery, was 6 blocks south of Houston Street. At Houston and Bowery, at the crossroads, derelicts converged in the heavy crosstown traffic. When cars stopped for the light, bums would come up and wash the windshields and ask for money. That also goes on in Delhi as well. South of Houston, the first blocks held mostly restaurant supply stores, lamp stores, taverns, and luncheonettes. The buildings were of 3 and 4 stories, old, narrow, crowded tenements, their faces covered with heavy fire escapes. Traffic on the Bowery ran uptown and downtown, as we saw there. Cars parked on both sides of the street, and the constant traffic passed tightly. During the business day, working people passed briskly among the slow-moving derelicts. Many of the store windows were covered with protective iron gates, but behind the gates, the store owners lit their varieties of lamps to attract prospective wholesale and retail customers. So you have that here also in India. You have to put bars on your windows so that the thieves don't break in. And also because of the derelicts and the alcohols living there, it was also a place for prostitution. Two things go together. The degradation. That's why the no intoxication and no illicit sex. So when you're engaging in illicit activities, they usually go on in the same place. So all these things would go on, and the police would be wandering trying to keep the innocent people, the people going about their business, from getting robbed, getting mugged, and the prostitution. So it was a very, very degraded area. But Prabhupada, even where Prabhupada lived, the drunkards would be sitting on his steps going up to his room, and they would be very respectful to Srila Prabhupada. They could sense that he was a dignified, aristocratic person, and they treated him respectfully. But when Mukunda went up for the first time to attend Prabhupada's class, they started cursing him. They wouldn't move. They wouldn't let him in. And then finally, he had to push around them. He got into the door, and in the hallway, and this is everywhere, we had heard earlier that when Prabhupada lived uptown, everywhere was the smell of dog stool, because the dogs would pass, everyone had their pets, they would pass stool. Now that's changed. Now the people have to clean up the dog stool and carry it with them wherever they go. So similarly, all over the Bowery, there were 3 smells, and that was liquor, urine, and vomit. So when Mukunda, for the first time, got into the house where Prabhupada was, the same thing in the hallway also. He could smell the urine, vomit, and the liquor. And there were no lights, so he had to find his way up the stairs, but he heard the kartals playing. So, but Prabhupada, he was completely transcendental. And Mukunda says in his book that when he entered and saw Prabhupada and heard the chanting, it was as if he was in a garden pasture, because the whole atmosphere was transcendental within Prabhupada's room. So this is how a transcendentalist can even bring Vrindavan with them. Prabhupada, in the most degraded area, in the biggest and most degraded city in the world probably, New York, Prabhupada was able to create a transcendental atmosphere wherever he was. 94 Bowery was a narrow 4-story building. It had long ago been painted gray and bore the usual facing of a massive black fire escape. A well-worn, we can see pictures of this so you understand what, see these? Now this is by law, you have to have all of these stairways because fires would be so common, and if they didn't have a way to escape, they would be caught up in their room with it, and they would suffocate to death. So every building had to have fire escapes, and that's these stairways and these platforms to walk down in case of fire. So all the buildings had that. You see, it was painted gray here. This is supposed to be the building where Prabhupada was. And you can see the derelicts lying on the ground, on the steps, in front, right on the road. A well-worn black double door, its glass panels reinforced with chicken wire, opened onto the street. The sign above the door read, AIR, Artists in Residence, 3rd and 4th, indicating that artists in residence occupied those floors. The first floor of the next building, north, 96 Bowery, was used for storage, and its front entrance was covered with the rusty iron gate. At 98 Bowery was another tavern, Harold's, smaller and dingier than the Half Moon. Thus, the block consisted of 2 saloons, that's bars, a flop house, that's where the men could stay at night and then they had to come out during the daytime. They're called flop houses, and 2 buildings with lofts. In the 1960s, loft living was just beginning in that area of New York City. The city had given permission for painters, musicians, sculptors, and other artists who required more space than available in most apartments to live in buildings that had been constructed as factories in the 19th century. After these abandoned factories had been fitted with fireproof doors, bathtubs, shower stalls, and heating, an artist could inexpensively use a large space. These were the AIR lofts. So, has anyone ever seen an AIR loft? Yeah, you've seen? Okay. Here in India, they don't have those things, but my brother lived in one of these. And when I would go see him, it's a huge building. I mean, a huge room. And there's nothing. It's completely empty. And they put a shower, they install water, and they put some bedding, and they'll put a stove. But other than that, it's a completely empty space. And that was an advantage for Srila Prabhupada, because that way he was able to hold his programs, and as many people as wanted to come were able to attend then. And that way the attendance grew, because we heard last week that everything was getting very tight. Mukunda, when he went up to 72nd Street to meet Prabhupada the first time, no, I don't think it was Mukunda, I think it was another person was describing that it became very tight. Oh, Bill Epstein from the Paradox. He went up because Harvey Cohen kept telling him, you have to go see this new Swami uptown. So he went in, and there wasn't enough room for everybody there. But now that Prabhupada moved down to the Bowery, despite the bad area, there was more facility for growth, and that was a great advantage. Harvey Cohen's loft on the top floor of 94 Bowery was an open space almost 100 feet long from east to west. So this room might be 25 feet long. You can imagine a room four times bigger than this. That's how much room Prabhupada had. And 25 feet wide. So it was as wide as this room and 4 times longer. It received a good amount of sunlight on the east, the Bowery side, and also had windows at the west end. So on both sides, Prabhupada would get the morning sun and the afternoon sun as well as a skylight. Because Prabhupada was on the top floor, what they do is they cut a big hole and they put glass there so that you could even get sunlight from the roof. The exposed rafters of the ceiling were 12 feet above the floor. It's very high. Harvey Cohen had used the loft as an art studio, and racks for paintings still lined the walls. A kitchen and shower were partitioned off in the northwest corner, and a room divider stood about 15 feet from the Bowery side windows. This divider did not run from wall to wall, but was open at both ends, and it was several feet short of the ceiling. It was behind this partition that Prabhupada had his personal living area. A bed and a few chairs stood near the window. So now Prabhupada at least had a bed and some chairs, because in his little room 307 he had nothing except for his trunk. And Prabhupada's typewriter sat on his metal trunk next to the small table that held his stacks of Bhagavatam manuscripts. His dhotis hung drying on a clothesline. On the other side of the partition was a dais, about 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep, on which Prabhupada sat during his kirtans and lectures. The dais faced west, toward the loft's large open space, open, that is, except for a couple of rugs and an old-fashioned solid wood table, and on an easel Harvey's painting of Lord Chaitanya dancing with his associates. So you can remember when Harvey, for the first time, went to visit Prabhupada in room 501, after Harvey had met Prabhupada at the Ananda Ashram. Prabhupada had on his trunk a small picture of the Panchatattva dancing. So Harvey offered to paint that. And he made a big size, and that's the same painting that later was on the storefront window at 26 2nd Avenue. So now, in the room of Harvey, it was on an easel there in that big space. The loft was a 4-flight walk up, and the only entrance, usually heavily bolted, was a door in the rear at the west end. From the outside, this door opened into a hallway, lit only by a red exit light over the door. The hallway led to the right a few steps and into the open area. If a guest entered during a kirtan or lecture, he would see Swami about 30 feet from the entrance, seated on his dais. A dais means a raised platform, like a manch. A little higher, so Prabhupada was sitting above the group. On other evenings, the whole loft would be dark, but for the glow of the red exit light in the little hallway and a soft illumination radiating from the other side of the partition where Prabhupada was working. Prabhupada lived on the Bowery sitting under a small light, while hundreds of derelicts also sat under hundreds of naked lights on the same city block. He had no more fixed income than the derelicts, nor any greater security of a fixed residence, yet his consciousness was different. He was translating Srimad Bhagavatam into English, speaking to the world through his Bhaktivedanta purports. His duty, whether on the 14th floor of a Riverside Drive apartment building or in a corner of a Bowery loft, was to establish Krishna consciousness as the prime necessity for all humanity. He went on with his translating and with his constant vision of a Krishna temple in New York City. Because his consciousness was absorbed in Krishna's universal mission, he did not depend on his surroundings for shelter. Home for him was not a matter of bricks and wood, but of taking shelter of Krishna in every circumstance. As Prabhupada had said to his friends uptown, "Everywhere is my home." Whereas without Krishna's shelter, the whole world would be a desolate place. Often he would refer to a scriptural statement that people live in 3 different modes: goodness, passion, and ignorance. Life in the forest is in the mode of goodness. Life in the city is in passion. And life in a degraded place like a liquor shop, a brothel, or the Bowery is in the mode of ignorance. But to live in a temple of Vishnu is to live in the spiritual world, Vaikuntha, which is transcendental to all these 3 material modes. So Srila Prabhupada, he would often explain to us that these temples are embassies to the spiritual world. They're like oases, that you can come here anywhere in the world to a Krishna conscious temple and you're in the spiritual world. News of the Swami's move to the Bowery loft spread, mostly by word of mouth at the Paradox restaurant, and people began to come by in the evening to chant with him. The musical kirtans were especially popular on the Bowery. Now we have to remember that when Prabhupada was giving his classes uptown, he didn't have chanting. He would just give his lectures on Bhagavad Gita. But now he was in a completely different atmosphere with young people who were musicians and artists, and their life was music. So they appreciated Prabhupada's chanting very much. So he would chant with them, and they would bring their musical instruments, and they would chant along with Prabhupada and enjoy the music. The musical kirtans were especially popular on the Bowery, since the Swami's new congregation consisted mostly of local musicians and artists who responded more to the transcendental music than to the philosophy. So uptown, they were listening to the philosophy, and here they appreciated the music more than the philosophy. Every morning he would hold a class on Srimad Bhagavatam. So Prabhupada had his Monday, Wednesday, and Friday classes in the evening, but now in the morning he was also having classes. Attended by David Allen, that's who Satru Maharaj calls Paul Murray David Allen, Robert Nelson, Prabhupada's old friend from uptown, and another boy. And occasionally he would teach cooking to whoever was interested. He was usually available for personal talks with any inquiring visitor or with his new roommate. So Mukunda, when he started attending the classes, he, of course, a class means there were several people there taking part, and he would ask questions, just as last week we heard he asked about if you see a young man beating an old man, should you stop, should you intervene? And Prabhupada eventually said, yes, you should. But he wanted to get to know Prabhupada on a personal level. So he would come when there weren't classes to speak to Prabhupada and to get some direction in his life. And he didn't even know about Prabhupada's books at the time. He just wanted to talk to Prabhupada. So he would come, sometimes he came, and the downstairs door would be locked. And he would take pennies, that's little coins, and he threw them at the window, hoping that Paul would hear the coins on the window and come down. But instead, Prabhupada came to the window. And Prabhupada, he put up his finger like this, just wait a minute. Prabhupada himself came all the way down the 4 flights of stairs and opened up the door for Michael to come up and speak to him. And then he would ask him various questions because he didn't understand how the Bhagavad Gita was so important, because everyone was interested in peace at that time. America was at war in Vietnam, and the young people didn't want to have anything to do with war. So he couldn't understand how this conversation between Krishna and Arjuna on a battlefield could have spiritual significance. So he met a young girl who was a classical dancer from India, and she said, this is symbolic, that we have so many wars within our life, we have so many problems, and this is a conversation to help us get through those disasters in our life. So still it didn't sit right with him. And then he asked Prabhupada about Gandhi and Nehru. And Prabhupada replied that actually it wasn't Gandhi who liberated India. It was Subhash Chandra Bose, because he made the National Indian Army. And he threatened the British. And therefore the British knew that they couldn't fight because they were in the middle of a war. So therefore they left India. So Prabhupada, Prabhupada explained to Mukunda that I was also a follower of Gandhi. But then I understood that the British were just patting him, and he was compromising with them. So it wasn't he who got the British out. It was Bose who got the British. They call him now Netaji. Now that he's getting the honor that was deserved long back. So then Mukunda showed him, he carried a picture of Nehru. And they probably, oh, another rascal. So because this is as much information was coming to America about India, So then Prabhupada set him straight. And then there was another very intelligent young man who was, I believe he was, I don't know what his profession was, but he was attending regularly. His name was Carl Jurgens. And he also took initiation from Prabhupada. Prabhupada named him Karlapati. It's a name for Lord Shiva. So Carl told Mukunda about Prabhupada's books. So Mukunda went another time to get the books. And Prabhupada showed him the books, and he told him they were $15. Mukunda only had $5. Prabhupada said, that's all right. And, later you can give. And that was when he started reading those books, and he realized that the Sanskrit was there, and that way he would be able to learn Sanskrit, because Mukunda felt that people would be interested in Sanskrit here. So he asked Prabhupada, could we have a Sanskrit class? And Prabhupada, he reluctantly agreed. That petered out because Prabhupada wasn't actually interested in teaching Sanskrit. He was interested in teaching about Krishna. But when Mukunda got these books, he realized that everything was in these books, and he couldn't put them down. And he learned by reading the Srimad Bhagavatam about cleanliness, about proper lifestyle. He started taking a bath every morning, and most people didn't do that in America. And he learned about how to be vegetarian, because he wanted to be vegetarian, but the only place he could go was the paradox. And macrobiotic food is very boring. It's just brown rice. He said they would give you brown rice, zucchini, some sesame seeds, and some beans. And that was all they had. But when Prabhupada cooked, everything was just so full of flavor and so much variety. We'll read later when Prabhupada had his first love feast. And nobody could understand what a love feast was, but they were so amazed by all the varieties that Prabhupada cooked all by himself. And he had the women help. He had Carl's girlfriend, Carol. She brought all of her pots, and she helped Prabhupada. And she explained how Prabhupada was so systematic in how he cooked and everything. He wouldn't taste anything, because in the West, they make sure the right amount of salt, and you put the spoon you tasted with right back in the pot. So unhygienic. So they didn't know anything about cleanliness. And Prabhupada was teaching them all these things by example, and now also by the books. So Mukunda was trying to learn, he was trying to practice what Prabhupada was putting in his books. So we'll read more. Although Prabhupada and David each had a designated living area in the large loft, the entire place soon became dominated by Prabhupada's preaching activities. Prabhupada and David got on well together, and at first Prabhupada considered David an aspiring disciple. Now, when Mukunda first saw Paul, who was the roommate, he thought that he was very weird. Prabhupada had just finished a lecture. Prabhupada was talking about the three modes of nature, and how in goodness, how one acts, in passion, and how in ignorance one acts. And at the end of the class, Prabhupada asked for questions, and Michael, Mukunda, was waiting to see, is he going to get up and just leave like the other swamis in the Buddhist thing? No, Prabhupada just sat there very quietly, and people asked questions. He was completely available for the people. And then he said to Paul, water please, and he gave Paul a brass water cup. And Paul quickly ran and got the water and gave it to Prabhupada, and Prabhupada, in his usual way, he drank water without touching the glass to his mouth. And no one had ever seen anything like that before. No one had even heard, because there's a sound that you make when you drink like that. And Mukunda was completely astounded when he saw that. But he saw that Paul was like a robot. He wasn't acting like a normal person with Prabhupada. And it made Mukunda very uncomfortable. That is this the way you become when you become one of the followers of Swamiji? So he said, he thought, maybe it's just this boy is very strange. Because he wouldn't put the glass down, he was just holding it like it was something very sacred. And he felt there was something very unnatural in Paul, the way he was behaving with Prabhupada. So there were signals beforehand that something was not quite right. The thing that was not quite right was that Paul had come to New York to investigate the drug scene, intoxication, and he was starting to take LSD, which is a very strong hallucinatory drug. And of course, Prabhupada in his innocence didn't realize any of these things. So while Paul was apparently taking up spiritual life, on the side he was taking intoxication, which made him misbehave. And eventually Prabhupada had to flee for his life and not go back there. Okay, so now it's 7 o'clock. We'll have, because the next entry after this of Satsvarup Maharaj is April 27th. And a few weeks ago, we started going through the beginnings, the month of April, and we only got up to the April 8th. So I was going to go through from the 8th to the 27th with you, because there's a gap in the Lilamrita, and we can read about what Prabhupada was doing during those 2-3 weeks, and then catch up with Satsvarup Maharaj's April 27th. So that's what we have to look forward to next week. Hare Krishna. Jai.